So today we are going to read first from John chapter 9, verse 1 through 12. Please rise for the gospel reading today. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned that this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. And then the man went and he washed, and he became able to see. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" And some were saying, "Yes, it's he." And others were saying, "No, but it's probably somebody like him." And he kept saying, "I am the man." But they kept asking him, "Well, then how are your eyes opened?" And he answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' And then I went and washed, and I received my sight." And they said to him, "Well, where is he?" And the man said, "I do not know." Please be seated. We're also reading from Ephesians chapter 5. Chapter 5, verses 8 to 11. "For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. So let us live as children of the light. For the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord, and take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them." This is the word of the Lord. Some years ago, for a period, I posted photos on social media that I called "Absurd Adventures in Country Commuting." I lived in the middle of farmland, and so this was my commute every day. Some days there might be a couple of horses loose on a state highway. Once there was a flock of sheep enjoying the tall grass on the wrong side of their fence. And of course, there were a lot of armadillos, always on their backs, their feet up in the air. Stupid armadillos. After one early December sunset, I was driving home from church along a lane that was lined on each side by dry stacked limestone walls, just limestone piled up. The night was foggy, and there was always the possibility of encountering deer on that road. So I turned up my high beams, and I also switched on the wide-angle fog lamps on the car. And then I came over a short rise, and there, in the middle of the road, about 50 feet in front of me, a couple of dozen luminous lights floated in the air. They aimed straight at me like flashlights in the night. Well, I thought my imagination was playing tricks on me. Something was out of place here, because I'd been down that road many times and never experienced anything like this. It was almost otherworldly. But as I crept along slowly, I began to see that it was not swamp gas or space aliens or coon hunters. There, taking up all the width of the road from limestone wall to limestone wall, was a disorganized, confused bunch of calves. Their eyes stood out while their black bodies just blended into the light. And in my car, the headlamps stood out while the dark blue body of the car blended into the light. So there we were, staring at each other, not able to make anything to do with it. And I thought, I know those cows. They are my neighbor's cows. And they're out here on a school night, headed down the road to town to, the Papa Top, or maybe the Walmart parking lot. But the big thing I noticed was the look on the faces of those cows. Stopped, dead in their tracks, caught, red-handed, wide-eyed, staring at the halogen lights of my car. They probably didn't believe their eyes any more than I believed my own eyes. It was that look they gave me, was that look that people have when they confront something so unexpected and absurd that there's just no reasonable expectation for it. That's the look of the faces of those calves. And maybe, just maybe, it was the look of the faces of the townspeople and the Pharisees in our text from John. Sometimes seeing what you see can be a baffling experience, even to the point that you may not believe you are seeing the thing that you are really seeing. They didn't believe what they saw. In fact, they wanted to see something else entirely, something more reasonable, something more acceptable to their knowledge and experience, something that made sense to them. And I think as you read the Gospels, you see that happen a lot in the Gospels when rigid ideas stand face to face with Jesus as he reveals some unexpected and maybe some unwanted truth. So as we consider the story today in John's Gospel, maybe we should consider what we see when we look at those Gospel situations. Are we like a jumbled confused herd on a dark road at night, baffled and confused? Do we see something we reject because it contradicts the reasoned systems of faith that are comfortable to us? First thing I notice in this story is the first thing that comes out of the mouths of the disciples. It's the question of whose sinfulness caused this man's blindness. It's got to be somebody's fault after all. Random acts of biology don't just happen. And that is, in the Bible, a theology that comes out of Deuteronomy, the blessings and curses that Moses talked about. If somebody's life is miserable or tragic, then it must be punishment from God. But then Jesus refutes that categorically. No, that's not what it is at all. The man's blindness was neither his fault nor his parents' fault. However, it was an opportunity for revelation. I wonder how many times we run into or run across revealing situations, and we just write them off. We ignore them. How often do we see something and refuse to be broadened by the experience of seeing that thing because it isn't rational or culturally acceptable? So Jesus meets the blind man, and then he does something that echoes the creation story, the creation of Adam from the dust of the ground, and the saliva and the mixture of that with the dust makes mud. Jesus gives the man sight with the mud made from his divine saliva and the dirt of the earth. Unfortunately, that's when this man's troubles began. He had once been pitied, but accepted. And once he gains sight, he becomes rejected by peers and neighbors, and even by the elite religious class, the Pharisees. They could imagine his blindness the way the disciples first thought of it, as some sort of moral circumstance, but they couldn't see his new eyesight as a holy revelation. Who has the power to do something like that, they said. Only God. And this Jesus character, well, he's not God. He's a charlatan doing magic, the Pharisees said. And not only that, but he's doing this stuff on the Sabbath. And that's wrong. That can never happen. No good works like this could ever happen on the Sabbath. This Jesus is a heretic. And of course, in that society, once the Pharisees declared there's something fishy, well, everybody jumps on their side. Whatever their thoughts might have been, once the Pharisees make a judgment, everybody sides with the Pharisees. Why do you think that is? Why do the other people join up with the point of view of the Pharisees? Even the blind man's parents in the story, they're called to explain, do you know this person? Is this your son? How did he get to be able to see? What happened? And what do they say? They say, we don't know. He's old enough to speak for himself. Ask him. They get out of the whole thing, because if they say he was healed by Jesus, well, then Jesus must be the Messiah. If he's healed by Jesus, then Jesus must be from God. He must be God. The Pharisees, however, had already proclaimed that anyone who believes Jesus is a Messiah would be excommunicated. You can't be a faithful Jew and believe Jesus is a Messiah. And so ultimately, the Pharisees drive the newly sighted man out, away, because his statements are not compatible with what they know. To say that Jesus healed him is not appropriate theology. It's not appropriate revelation, because the only revelation that matters to them is revelation from Moses. The story actually goes 41 verses. I don't know why in the last several weeks in Lent we've had these really long sections of gospel, but here we are. It's a long story, and there's lots of characters and there's lots of conversations. And really, if you read it from a literature point of view, it's worthy of Shakespeare. In some ways, it's timeless. It's even a modern story. The blind man can be anybody stigmatized by anything, and yet strangely accepted in their condition as long as they stay in their place. If they change, they're no good. And the Pharisees, well, they speak for all those of any era who don't have some kind of prophetic imagination to see all the new possibilities that God is constantly doing. They can't see anything beyond a concrete, rigid ideology. They stick to oral traditions from going back to Moses, hard and fast traditions with no cracks that might let some new understanding seep in. That tradition for them is a gatekeeper. It keeps everything out. In the context of John 3:19, they might be called people who hate the light that Christ brings into the world. They never consider that they might have missed an essential truth because they're living in the dark. And then there's everybody else in the story, even the parents and all the neighbors, all the background voices. They kind of operate like a chorus in a Greek play. They chant the expected chant of conformity. What do they see? What do we see as we look on this story? For one thing, there's a thread of sinfulness that winds through the story from the very opening verses through the very end. People see the blind man for a condition they think was caused by sinfulness. While he's blind to the world, they are blind to the truth that Jesus has demonstrated. So, who really is the sinful one in the story? The newly sighted man believes Jesus' truth. And then he expertly puts the Pharisees in their place. He knows Jesus is divine, and he says, we know God does not listen to sinners, but God does listen to those who worship and obey God's will. If this man is not from God, well, then he couldn't do anything. And at the end of the episode, the end of the chapter, after the Pharisees have driven him away, Jesus finds the man again, and he says, in their conversation, he says, I have come into the world for judgment, so that those who do not see might see, and those who do see might become blind. Some Pharisees were listening, and they questioned this. They said, surely we're not blind, are we? I'm willing to bet that we might be blind a lot. And yet, I also know that here we are in Lent. And in Lent, we're supposed to take the opportunity in the season to think of the ways that we might be blind to God's truth, to the new things that God is doing all around us. We might be blind to all these things, and it might be that the way in which we see things, even faith, is specifically the way we want to see it. We want to see the things that fit into our reasoned systems of faith. And so if John's gospel is trying to teach us something through this story, I think it's teaching us to look at how we live our own faith. What revelations do we see, and which ones are we blind to? How often do we stand baffled and confused and too afraid to go against social convention when God opens our eyes to a truth that is above and beyond everything we have previously known or understood? You know, Jesus never provides us with a checklist. Maybe the Beatitudes is a kind of checklist. But he never really gives us a list like the Torah does, a list of things we should do in order to be faithful followers. Instead, he gives us examples of people who are faithful followers. And the gospel writers ask their faith communities to put themselves into those examples and situations of faithful following. And so that's probably our challenge today on this Sunday in Lent. We have to put ourselves into that story. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we see? What are we unwilling to see? The old prophets, the prophets of old, proclaimed that God is always doing a new thing, always revealing a new light to people who walk in darkness. So the question remains, do we have the imagination to see the truth that Jesus reveals? Amen.